Hi everyone, a very warm welcome to Olafur Eliasson.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you.
And thank you all so much for being here. Many thanks also to Sam Keller and the Beyeler Dream Team. We should give them also a very big round of applause. We've recorded so many conversations, but today is very special because we're going to talk about life. We're going to talk about Leben, Nebel, about life, fog, about the amazing piece you created here, the transformative piece where the insides were on the outsides. And I thought maybe we could focus in this interview, in this conversation, foremost, of course, about this piece, but also about some other works of yours where you actually worked with water, where also the insides were on the outsides. And it's interesting because Edouard Glissant once told me that actually exhibitions are very often presented in contexts which are invisible to large sections of society because, of course, museums have doors. And you know, he felt that it's important that we find other forms of engagements where we can actually open up institutions and bring art into a more open situation, which is, of course, what you've created here. But you've done that many times before. I remember always when in 1998 we did with Klaus Biesenbach and Nancy Spector the first Berlin Biennial, and we invited you. You did the River Project, and more or less at the same time, our friend Okwien Welzer, the late Okwien Welzer, whom I would like to remember here tonight, he invited you to the Joburg Biennial, an incredibly important exhibition. And there you actually did not just work in the river, but you literally flooded a neighborhood. And as this piece here, we're going to see later, has to do with flooding the museum, I wanted to maybe begin with asking you to tell us about the river and also about the flooding of Johannesburg, a river project which actually initially was a rumor and then somehow became a reality.
Yes, thank you, Hans, and thank you for so efficient, the glamorous way you presented, and I just started talking. That's really qualitative, wonderful. I'm so now I feel like relaxed to be in your comfortable hands. So, River. More anecdotally, I just closed an exhibition in Tokyo at the MOT Museum of Tokyo, and the title of the show was "Sometimes," sort of appropriate here. Sometimes the river is the bridge. And it's a First Nations way of talking from a sort of manner of speaking from Canada. And I just like, sometimes the river is the speech, sometimes the river is the bridge. It has a lot to do with our inability or the need to us to sort of reconsider the sort of, not what we see, but the system of seeing in it as of itself. In 96 or 7, I was in Johannesburg because of Okui with a photo series from Iceland with melting ice, actually, and it was called "Looking for Hot Water" and a bit, and I was so excited about being in Johannesburg that I said to Okui, "Can I please do something more?" I was like so ambitious. So it's like, oh, this photo. So it's like, so anyway, but outside of the exhibition, in the sort of downtown derelict area, see, this is only very briefly after, 5 years after apartheid, and there was the downtown, and there was this water reservoir, which was rainwater, essentially, so not drinking water, that was pulled together because of the sort of city trees, the palm trees and so on. But otherwise, the city center was more or less just a squatted area. So it was interesting, and Okui said, "No, there's no need for any other artworks, Olafur. Just stick to the photos." And then I went and rented a pump, a small diesel generating pump for, I remember it's like 20 euro or something at the time. And then I brought it and I sucked the water out of this reservoir. It was not quite as big as this, but maybe half the size of this. And in 3 hours, I pumped out the whole reservoir, and I sort of made a little tube so it would run the furthest way, and I called it erosion, because it was also about the ability for the river to sort of wash through the city. And I've done it a few times. And Okui came out, and he came out and he stood and looked, and he said, "Ah, shit." I said, "Ah." And there's Olafur, "This is wonderful. but do not do it again, he said. And then he went in, turned around and went in. And, but then Hans Hake came, and I was so proud because I evidently knew the work of Hans Hake, and this is only a few years after he had done his famous German pavilion, where he broke up the floor and he took Germania on the inside. It was like fantastic for young artists. I was so happy to meet him. And he said, water, and yeah, he also used to do these more ephemeral works. He said, oh, this is so great. He had made flags. And somehow the question of north and north-south, or, you know, sort of Johannesburg and so, and I said, but don't forget, I said to him, we are on the southern hemisphere, so north is the other way, and west is east, and east is west. So it's actually turning you the wrong way, the piece. And he looked at me, and he said, no, it's just of course, east and west is the same, I said. And then he just turned around and went. I never saw him since. So there was I with my piece, and these were the two people who saw it.
And the river, of course, happened also several times. I remember you did it in Stockholm with Daniel Birnbaum, and it was kind of a rumor. And then you did it in Berlin for our Berlin Biennial in the Spree. And it was actually a test run which happened using this. Of course, it looks very, very toxic, but it's actually non-toxic, water-soluble dye, which is actually used usually to kind of test ocean currents. And it's kind of unforgettable to me because the transformation was so immense, because literally the spray went green within a few minutes, but you just had this little, backpack or bag. It wasn't big at all. Can you tell us about this and, in a way, how it happened in several cities?
Yeah, so for some time, thank you for asking, Hans, and that is actually the green color which was in this exhibition that I had here. The very same color. It's called uranin. So marine biologists, or divers who swim in caves underwater to find out where the water is flowing, they have this ultraviolet sort of dye, and a little bit you can sort of color everything. So it's very exciting. And of course, St. Patrick's Day in Ireland is like kind of like everywhere. So the idea at the beginning was that water in a city, of course, represents a kind of a dynamic force. As we tend to organize our city spaces around sort of urban theory, we have not in modernity sort of prioritized the flows and the temporalities, or the way a water actually introduces a different kind of, movement, or different kind of time. On the contrary, we just see, okay, river. Okay, East River, Hudson River, Strömmen is called in Stockholm, and the government sits on an island in downtown Stockholm, and then there's like a bridge, and then the river goes like to and around, and this is the government building, and very often you have these small postcard ideas of this is Stockholm, and it so happened that Stockholm was under very heavy regulations about preventing new buildings, so it was sort of kept sort of strategically to look like old Stockholm. So, because otherwise it's not like the real Stockholm. And this is the question, what is then reality? And I said, okay, why can I not see if I could make a hyper-real or even more real by making it, unreal somehow? But the point is here, the green color, it goes into the water. And then, of course, there's tons of turbulence, as we know. And this is clear water. It's not these glacial murky rivers like some places here. Also, it's not like the what's it called? Not the Rhine, right? And I had a little can, and your colleague Daniel Birnbaum, he was standing there because I had a small exhibition, and he was like, maybe we should not do it, he said. And I was on the bridge, and there was like just cars, no bicycles, no pedestrians. I said, I'll just quickly drop it in. There's a good stream here. And so I just opened the can, I just like poured it out, but the wind just whoosh, took it, and I just looked. And then I looked over at Daniel, it's really far away, and then everything was green. I was like, okay, I'm just going to walk very quiet towards Daniel, like the long bridge. So I was walking, and suddenly there was no cars coming. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to walk. And the can, I was like, what to do with the can? And then I said, oh, this is so strange, there's no cars. Then I turned around, and then all the cars had stopped. And I really started sweating. And then I looked, and then Daniel was gone. I said, okay. Then I walked further around the corner. I threw the can into a sort of a bin and went down to the city center. And there was a man in overall fishing. And I could just see the green color coming, just like this. And the guy was fishing, and he was like looking and fishing and looking and fishing. And suddenly all the green came, and everyone from the pedestrian area, they started looking at it, and it was really real. Because suddenly you could see the water, right? As it was not a postcard anymore, it was not a representation of an idealized city 100 years ago, it was actually a real space. See, now this is actually a while ago, so the argument about reality and space and dynamic forces was one which is now maybe different. Just briefly, the police next day had an article in the biggest paper saying that uneased Swedish citizens had called the police, wondering what it was, but the police could calm everyone down, very Swedish, by saying that this was a leak in the heating system of the government building. And there was no reason to worry. And I was like, how? It kind of like sort of took away the sort of the potential somehow. But anyway, it was also, I could then travel home safely on the plane the next day, so there was no problem. But then on the plane home, I was with the same paper, and it says, there was an art review, and said it was actually not a sort of a leak, it was an artwork. It was in fact a watercolor. And I only got 2 stars, because it was really a poorly executed watercolor, because it only had one color, first of all. And it was so funny, and so I got a very bad critique, but I was out of Sweden and so on and so forth. But joke aside, I also in Los Angeles I did it in Tokyo, I did it in several places. You might remember the book Cadillac Desert about the water politics, and if you didn't read that, then there was Chinatown about the water, you know, the mafia and the water in Los Angeles, like fantastic film about that, and interestingly. The Wrigley family, the chewing gum, the highway, and all the Cadillacs. And why would you put a city in the desert? So in every city, I kind of had a slightly different idea. And the water also became about life, and it became about livelihood, and about what does it take for a city to actually respirate? What is it that brings about the opportunity to photosynthesis? But why are we alive, you could say? Is it not because we are breathing, and who are responsible for us breathing? And what do they need? They need water. I mean, it's the trees, right? Photosynthesis. So who are we to thank for our respiratory presence? Is our ancestors standing all over the place here behind us, if you want to say it this way. So the water projects in various ways, whether in glaciers or in rivers, and this was always a part of the work, sometimes in reflections, bouncing off the water, but it was very much borrowing all this sort of potential of the water, as it was often underestimated. So I did it over the years, and then I stopped doing it at 9/11, because this sort of hyper sort of presence in a space suddenly, and I felt uncomfortable. I was in New York during 9/11, so I thought, okay, this sort of incredible sort of intervention, there was another kind of fear. There was another kind of like, there was another sort of polarization or binary sort of right and wrong, and it was very uncomfortable, so I said, I won't do it. It was also important to say that I found out around that time, or briefly after, that there was also another artist, an Argentinian artist, who had done something similar with green, red, and blue, and he had sort of made watercolors and somehow done something similar. And also, when I found out that, I said, okay, I need to address that and find out where he is and how to do it, and maybe do it with him. And there was also, you know, evidently it turns out that there was a certain green movement who also did it, and the Extinction Rebellion also do it, and there was like, so like everyone does it anyway. But to go away from the green a little bit, of course, water has this thing about water and sanitation and health, and you do know that. So the sort of politics of waters is so complex, and only the last 3 years there has been a very stark increase in the attention of water. Like there's been droughts, like unprecedented droughts in South Africa and around the world. So see, the whole history of water, of course, has so much. There's both a spiritual, there's the kind of atmospheric, or you could say contemplative quality. There's the dripping of the water in Japanese gardens and so on. But there's also the politics of water. Who owns the water? It's like incredible, right? It actually turns out that 65% of all the water in Iceland belongs to a British businessman who just gradually bought it. maybe he's here because he actually collects art. But you know, it's like kind of, it's so interesting because every farmer in Iceland has a spring. Then there's this guy out in Britain who's just like buying springs and say, oh, that's great, let's sell them our springs. We're not using it anyway, right?
That's incredible. Of course, also water is more and more a rarefied resource. Silvio Moreles talked about that the other day. He says he drinks as much water as he can every day because it's becoming a more and more rarefied resource. But it's also actually here at the Beyeler for the first time that he then brought this idea of flooding so directly into a museum. I mean, it played a role in Bregenz. It did play a role in previous show, water. But here, it went much far beyond that. And I remember when you told me for the first time about this show, and you told me that Sam Keller and you had developed this project, you told me that you wanted to liberate the museum, that the project was not an exhibition. And I think that's interesting right now, because I've seen that quite a lot lately, actually, that a lot of artists seem to think right now to go beyond exhibitions. Maybe it has also to do with the conventions now of the exhibition, the time frame. Precious Okoyemon said the other day, they prefer gardens in a way, you know, to exhibitions, something you've also, of course, worked with. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily an exhibition, it was an urban intervention, and you changed here very much the rules of the game, in a way, what an exhibition usually is. I mean, beginning with the opening hours, because it was open 24 hours, also basically accessible for everyone with free admission. And one other thing I thought was very interesting is that it was kind of a rumor, no? Because the first time I heard about it was actually sort of through hearsay, through rumor. In that sense, that's why I wanted to start with the river, because the river was, of course, a hearsay piece, was a rumor. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis and how it went from this rumor here in Rien and from all your conversations with Sam to the production of a reality and, as you said, the liberation of the museum?
Thank you. Yeah, the question of liberation I wonder whether it's the right word, because it's very hard to find the right words, because in a sense we do not live in a time where the museum is sort of gefangen, or, you know, like caught up in and so on. But maybe it is sort of caught up in its own system, the sort of the routine and the ceremonial sort of way of doing things, and in a really sort of a strange way. I have already for quite some years talked to Sam Keller about the exhibition I had at the Louisiana Museum some 10 years before, so 8 or 7 years before, called Riverbed. It was like everything is water today. So that exhibition was just an empty riverbed that I took from Iceland, brought to Denmark without the water, because it's empty, because the snow has melted, there's a little spring. And then there are these riverbeds in Iceland, just like here in Switzerland, where there's no seeds. There's nothing, you know, there's no plants, there's no grass. And you stand in this massive riverbed like this, and there's no birds because there's nothing to eat for them, right? And what you feel is the absence of the presence of the water. It's like really magic. So I thought, okay, this is great for a show. I just get sent there. And you know, it's just like normal pebbles. It's just like roadside rocks. So we started taking the riverbed. I said, oh my God, we'll just take the rocks by the airport, no, by the harbor into containers. They're the same rocks anyway. And it was a wonderful show, and it was somehow touching because it was a show with nothing, and I took all shadows away with the lights. There was also, you couldn't really see your own shadow, so you wonder, I said, maybe I'm not. Yeah, maybe I'm not in life, right? So Sam and then we said, okay, finally we got around to and for that I'm very grateful. Sam said, it has to be the absolute best thing or wildest thing or most thing. You cannot make any compromise. And I just have to say, it is not. In a way, everyone says that, but actually no one says that, right? And so I'm very grateful for Sam. Now he finally came, so I can also say it. And I'm even more grateful to his amazing wife, Judith, who simply accepted that he was up all night, every night, because it was during COVID, so everything was kind of like upside down. And Sam and I, we sat, and I had not had that for many years since I was I don't know, I didn't have it I didn't talk to the museum director when I was a young artist, but you know, so we talked about, and suddenly the whole museum became almost like a sculpture. And Sam, I wouldn't call him an artist because he was like, but he was very creative. So I said, Sam, I think the day and the night, 24 hours, it was like, let's do something which is amazing at night. Imagine to come to the museum. Why are museums closed at night? It's like so amazing, it's magic. And you know, it's for children to go at the museum at night. They will never forget it. I don't understand why we closed the museums. And then there was, oh, okay, so and Sam had to go to the team, and I came back here. What about closing at 10? And then I said, ask them to calculate what is cheaper, to be open all the time or to close at 10 and open again at 9. Of course, it turns out that is actually not so hard. And well, and thanks to the team, and because then of course there's like kind of just like a cardboard wall, and on the other side there's a Picasso painting. And I didn't want any guards in this. I didn't want. So I really like the idea that you just come and then the museum is just open. And it's just like kind of go in. And we had many discussions about what are the soft boundaries of these great institutions. Of course, Beyeler also has this, it's sort of surfing on its own legacy wave. It's so famous and so on. So a little sort of open up at night is a much more radical thing here than it would be at the Kunstwerke in Berlin. It's like also fantastic. But there it's like, of course they're open at night. And then we started there, and then we started also saying, I don't want people to have to pay. And we made a little compromise with Sam, said like, if they pay, they pay. If they don't pay, they don't pay. And so we met sort of on the middle, and all these structures. Then I said, okay, we're just going to take out the windows. I called Renzo Piano. So of course, he didn't want to call Renzo Piano. It's much better if the artist calls Renzo Piano. Coward, Sam. So I had to call Renzo.
What did Renzo say?
So he said, actually what he said is, Olafur, why don't you just take the glass out? You don't have to take the whole facade away. And then I said, Renzo, you know, you always use the best glass in the world. It's everyone knows that. It's actually French, Saint-Gobain. And there's no, if you take the glass out, it looks the same. It looks like the glass is in because you use the best glass. And he said, that is correct, Olafur. I use the best glass. So, Olafur, I have a better idea. Why don't you take out the whole facade? Then you can see it's open. Yeah, I said, yes. Tell Sam that I told you to take out the whole facade. It's much better. Anyway, he accepted. Sam was very happy. Sam had to then go to the board. So if the board happens to be here, thank you also for not kicking Sam off. So we had all these sort of ongoing, and then we said, okay, we're going to flood the museum then. And then again, Sam has to go to the board, and there was like, there is a Modigliani painting right underneath the floor in the conservatory sort of there, and they don't want to move it because that's where the river, you know. So we have to make sure, and then we had to talk to them. Then the engineer came again. But in all honesty, there was an amazing collaboration, and I of course was also excited about it. I was just being more and more unreasonable. It was so much fun. And I was like looking, so I said to Sam, and I'm sorry I didn't mean to somehow just drive down this road, but just for you to understand the holistic, of course I was looking at plants with Günther Vogt. I was looking at sort of light and what do you call it, light biology. We were working on so many amazing things, and there was this sort of holistic thing. We were modeling the museum, and it was really interesting because suddenly it also became about, what about the staff? And there's this amazing staff here. And I was like really trying to, and that's why it's not really about well, a little bit of instability, but it's not about liberating. Because, so I suggested, and then they got really quiet, and Sam said, we need to send the whole staff to a conflict de-escalation course from the Rosenberg, the Institute. And everyone has to learn to be non-violent in their communication. So when people ask, oh, what time does it close? You don't say, das schließt 8 Uhr. But you don't say, so we try to deviate from this sort of rationalization of the very same temporalities we're trying to introduce. So we're trying to soften. We're also trying to exercise a kind of hospitality. How do we become more hospitable, a better host? How do we see the inherent and sort of the arrogance that we are, without noticing, totally sort of exercising all the time? Like the structural racism, for instance, like there's so much stuff where we are, without thinking about it, doing things. And of course the staff was not, I mean, so Sam was again, I don't know how, I wasn't doing the museum thing, so I don't know how he did it. We have, in another project on a university where I'm involved with research, there is something where we are doing micro-elicitation phenomenology. And that is very straightforward. It is how do we interview people by simply diving deeper and deeper and deeper into something they have experienced but maybe not noticed. And of course, this is like it's microphenomenology. It's also called Claire Petit-Marchand, who studied out of a French psychologist. I can look that up. But anyway, so very famous French phenomenologist, fantastic. And what she does, you walk through a door and you don't see the color of the door. You go in and look at the Picasso, right? And she goes, let's go back and let's just revisit. It's like psychology, right? Then you go, and 10th time after 1 hour, I go like, the door is red. Of course, I saw it. I just didn't store it in that part of the brain. And as we know, we can go back and revisit and de-traumatize if you want, or whatever, right? And also this is a technique, just to show how complex it is, that Mozart has developed very far. And they are, of course, like, in a certain scary way, they're so amazing at it. You just really go back and find out, what did you say in the beginning? And I always say that I, as an artist, I bring 50%. The other 50% is the viewer. It's just the kind of it's like very Scandinavian, democratizing everything, right? But there's some truth to it, because it actually has to do with, well, what is it then that people see? And of course, I take everything away. There's no sort of ice in the water. There's no figures. There's no sort of this or that. You know, it's just green water, in, out, birds. There's not really anything there. The plants are like half alive. There's like a little sort of mosquito and a fly, and then there's lots of animals. So they were also invited, animals and species and plants, right? Anyway, so we did this interview, and I just thought I'd just read one sentence from a person, and we asked, when does the exhibition start? When they left the school, this person said, and went into the bus. And there was a degree of authoritarian. They were into the bus, you have to go to the museum. And already by the arrival there, he was so negative about the museum because it's been not a very pleasant journey. And I think now I will just read you what he somehow said, because it's like, I know now I am only doing 50%, I'm only doing 25% maybe even. So because it's actually quite touching also, because we all think that we are experiencing the same, well, roughly speaking, right? It's like, oh, it's green color, it's like green, but evidently we don't. I mean, we also know we don't. So let me see. So Katrin Heimann, she's an assistant professor at the Interacting Mind Center in Aarhus, where experience, experiments, and research group. That's the group I'm in. And it's like amazing. But anyway, so we interviewed with microphenomenological interviews, students with migrant backgrounds, and the museum teams and other people, right? So this is the prompt that she says to the student. I would like to invite you to revisit the exhibition following some simple instructions to allow for a fresh experience. And then it goes on, please first find the place where the exhibition starts for you today. As I said, it was very different. Where does it start? And then it goes on and on and on. And there will be a scientific paper on this so in a later time. And I've been given the permit to, because we're doing it so correct. One participant said, or one visitor said, I like the three-dimensionality that opens up by the reflection. It opens up by the depth also. It is as if a virtual room is appearing, basically. First you perceive only the real situation, then it opens up to the vertical. Holes appear, the room opens up into the great depth. The effect is so strong and it is hard to get back to reality. I think this is actually happening only due to the leaves and the waves and the work. They work like a disturbing factor, reminding you that this is not a picture, this is water. They pull you back into the surface. and I have all these sort of great sentences, and some of them are pretty psychedelic. As once you revisit, and I can recommend it, because then I of course tried it myself, and there's like so much stuff you get the second time. It's a little bit like sex. And you know, so you go back and there's like, interestingly, a potential that we, due to the automatization, the routine, the ceremony, the kind of opening, and then the tears, and again you see the person you don't want to see, and so all these things, And then you go home and say, oh, that was a nice painting. It was a Picasso, right? And then, so why are we here if we don't even bother to look? I mean, I'm not saying you don't, but I kind of am, but you know what I mean. And of course, as an artist, I was so touched because it just gets more and more. And there was so much evidence of authoritarian power systems, social exclusion, inclusion, problems. Am I colored? Am I welcome? Is this park actually even for me? What about at night? I'm not, it's open at night, I hear, there's a rumor. It's so interesting. It's so interesting because the exhibition, of course, we just take it for granted. Oh, everyone, it says like democratic, it's free, you can come, but that's not how society is, right? So it's sort of a little exercise of parliamentary, so civic trust. Do we trust each other? We trust each other because we are like so similar, all of us. I mean, you're a little younger than me, but generally speaking, you know what I was just shorten it. You know what I'm about to say now, so I'll just shorten that. It is not inclusive enough. It is not open enough. It's not hospitable enough. And for Beyeler to take that in, I said, why don't we take that risk? We had rental toilets, everything, so it's not like that risky, right? And there was not a lot. There was a guard, but that guard is here anyway. The guard is probably here now, checking if you're running off with a Picasso. So it actually was quite interesting to see how it looked, and there was no riots. And also, we know this is now here, you know, Switzerland and so on. So in Berlin, I'm sure it would have been different. But just for a little exercise for us, all of us, what is it we are trying to achieve? And the water running into the museum and this idea of a balance between something, you know, is it beautiful, is it horrible? I think it's quite beautiful. And also, what was most violent? To take the facade out, what was the biggest sort of thing? Take out the facade. And so we took it out carefully. It's not like Godson as a clock. It's that penetrating macho, right? It's actually quite sensitive. And several people said to me, I came back and the facade was up again. So it was much more violent to put the facade in. So closing the museum again is so interesting. People reacted much stronger. When they were open, they just walked in and said, oh, the facade is missing. Wow. Right? But when it was up again, they said, wow, horrible. Oh, it was not horrible, Sam. You know what I mean. So the show had all these layers, and the team went so deep into this non-violent communication, and I'm so grateful for this because you can imagine this is so difficult to mobilize everything. And I must also say, COVID, you know, the whole idea, the idea of taking the facade was just not done a month or 6 weeks before COVID, and we were like, well, we're just going to say it's outside. There's no facade, it's just outside. You don't even go through the museum, you just go in through the ramp. And you know, the local authorities and all of that, so that was like, yeah, it's outside. And besides that, we worked with so many other, like with Light and biologists, and we had a new press strategy. I didn't do any press interviews, it was like fantastic.
And your work brings us back to Günter Vogt, who isn't here, but who is in Iceland. And you worked with, I mean, it's kind of fascinating and amazing, this text you've been reading, because I was actually thinking, it reminded me of, you know, when you did the Serpentine Pavilion with Ketty Thorsen. And there was this amazing story which actually came to my mind when I came here to experience your amazing piece at Beyeler, is what happened in the park when you did the pavilion. And all of a sudden, you know, somebody stopped us one morning and said they wanted to tell us the story of what happened. Remember the story, you know, with the daughter, they came to the park and all of a sudden the daughter ran into the pavilion. And so parents were telling us this story, that it was a transformative experience. And now the daughter is studying architecture and so on. And then I was asking if they saw the exhibition, and they said, no, we didn't. And I said, why? And then there was a silence. And then they said, because it's not for people like us. So in a way, this experience, this epiphany, would never have happened if you would not have put the pavilion into the park with open doors, and they could have just stumbled upon it and have this experience. And that's, of course, what happened here, particularly also with the 24 hours. But the inclusivity did not only happen in terms of visitors, but it happened actually in a very non-anthropocentric way, because you also welcomed trees, you welcomed plants. I remember when we visited, it was a few days before it opened, because there wasn't an opening, so I can't say a few days before the opening, but that's also something you changed.
The Hans moment, we call it.
And so there was this moment where we were with Sam and Isabella and you and friends, and then in a way, all of a sudden, there were birds with us, and you said soon the trees are going to arrive, so I already, imagined trees walking in. So it's a very, non-anthropocentric thing, and it's fascinating because I've been reading a lot lately Alexis Pauling-Gams, who in the Amazing Trilogy keeps saying that we have the opportunity now as a species, fully connected through technology, to actually unlearn and relearn our own patterns. We have the technology to think in new ways and tell new stories that allow us to exist in communion with our environments, kind of as opposed to dominating them. And I think the whole show has a lot to do with this communion. Can you talk a little bit about this idea also of, welcoming the animals into the show, welcoming the trees into the show, welcoming the plants into the show?
Yes, and in a sense that is very much where the show started, the lily pond, right? The water lilies, Monet, and Monet, who after the First World War wanted to give some paintings to the French state as a memorial of the peace, and he made the curve, which was in the ellipse room. MoMA has one. You have a very nice one, but it's not curved. But anyway, and I had the fortunate to hang some of my glassworks next to it. I was so proud, and I think if it's still here. But so it started, and as we have learned now for some time, it's called the anthropocentric, right? And then we also learned now it's actually called the planthropocentric, where anthropo is sort of inside of the planthropocentric. And I'm very grateful for the younger people who take upon themselves the belief, and it's not hope anymore, because hope is like kind of just like in Dante's door to hell, because I wasn't sure, door to hell, abandon all hope. That's a little bit where we are now. But anyway, so this notion of the theoretical basis where anthropology, biology, and identity politics, and a degree of decolonization theory. And there's so many young people who are like kind of, oh, of course, it's all just one thing. And I'm like, okay. So I talk about the silification, and they say, what silification? It's like actually just one thing. And so out of Basel, Anna Wirth's Justice, a circadian biologist, a light biologist, who in the 70s, Basel had this epiphany of finding out that the pre-born neonatal on the south side of the hospital, they got out 1 week earlier than the north side of the hospital, simply because of not the more light, but the circadian clock. Anyway, now this is very famous, and antidepressive therapy in Iceland. And so this is a woman, now she has retired and has time, because she's so amazing, to talk to people like us. So in the press package, we just threw her into the press, because she's much more interesting than me anyway. But here we are then, plants and species. So anyway, we filled it up with plants with Günther. We're trying to find plants that was sort of on the brink of being happy about being inside and outside. We documented the show, just to say, using a dog. We didn't film it. We told a dog. I thought the dog was called Lily. It was so funny, Lily Pond. I think it's called Lissy. No, what was it called? Lissy. Yeah, Lissy, yeah. It's an Ulla's dog, and it was a sort of a glacier rescue dog champion. And of course, it's so typical Beyeler to have like the champion dog. But anyway, this dog, we put somehow some kind of special dog GoPro camera, and then we asked the dog to do the documentation of the show. So I think that Beyeler anyway also documented it, but I said, this is the documentation. And of course, it's like kind of like this, and it's just running really fast. And I said, okay, but think about it, in 20, 30, 100 years, they're going to say, oh, they had a dog documented. But it's okay. And then we had ducks, and we had snakes, and then we had like a lot of animals, like würmer. They're really, robust rumor, and then there was flying up, and then there was like something up there. So online, because of COVID also, because nobody could come, it was like nobody there. We had all these sort of cameras in the garden out here, and every camera was organized around Van Oyksel's idea of animal vision that Lausanne University had worked a lot on. So we had a dog, of course. So online you could see a live transmission of 6 different, a frog, a fly, a spider. The spider was just under here, so it was like nothing to see. But that's how it sees it, right? And the dog, of course, is like really great, but it only has 2 colors, so it's like a duotone, and so on, right? So all the more than human, you call it, or non-human, we declared them our collaborators, and we asked them for advice. We asked Ulla's dog, so what do you think? I'm going to swim, it said. And it just jumped with the cameras into the water, and said, well, it's going to swim. And then we tried to copy a bat flying with a drone. Absolutely impossible. It looks like a drone. And so on and so on. So, and we made a whole online presentation where we had all these people saying and talking not on the expense of animals, but on behalf. But not like we are the zookeepers, these are our pets. But like the animals are just like our friends, our ancestors, our brothers and sisters. And it was very difficult because, you know, you kind of look at the cat and you go like, well, it's a cat. But to take the step out, and I found one person in Canada, in Toronto, the one with the, you know, it's not actually her, but sometimes the river is the bridge, Natasha Myers, a fantastic anthropologist, super progressive feminist, and biologist, and a dancer. So like the body, like dancer. It was like I could not believe my luck. And I spoke to her for 2 minutes, and I realized, I am so boring. She is amazing, and I'm so happy that there are people like that in the world.
Because you actually told me to read her book, and it's quite extraordinary because she came up with this idea, you know, we live in the Anthropocene, but she said that basically we should, from the Anthropocene, enter the Planthropocene, right?
Yeah, Planthropocene, yeah.
I think it would be great that you explain that to us. What's the Planthropocene? Because obviously your exhibition somehow, I felt it was a portal into the Planthropocene.
I have a quote from her, that's why I took it off her. So anyway, so there's a whole different kind of activism, there's a whole different type of seeing rules. She's just a little bit younger than me, and she's like in an activist group that goes out at night and rescues plants in people's houses who are not being treated right, and liberating them. But she's a professor at the University of Toronto. She did her PhD back in the days with Donna Haraway. You see, suddenly everything, she was with Evan Thompson, the famous phenomenologist who also worked with Dalai Lama and the mind and life, Francisco Varela. So there's this whole system which is popping up these new minds. And they are so much more radical on environment and on plants and species. And I'm not joking. So I'm looking at her on the Zoom call and say, oh, well, what's all these plants in all these glasses? Yeah, but this is like a nursery for all the plants we're rescuing. Oh, this is a lot. But can I just say, there are people like her, and I just want to credit her for a different kind of radicalism, which is so fundamentally, and it's not binary against us. It's not anymore about the binary ideas anyway. It's about, I guess you call it systemtheory, and about a whole new idea of a system. And there's a lot of anthropological relationship with the indigenous communities, the First Nation people in Canada, which right after then, of course, became a big thing as we learned. And the knowledge that we are able to enrich ourselves with from indigenous communities. And it's not esoteric. A lot of the knowledge is like, if you cut your hand, there's like 20 things you can do right here without having to go to the pharmacy. And so, of course, because they've lived 1,000 years sorting their way out. But there's just so many funny things. And I said, I'm tired. She said, I did therapy with the trees. This is somehow showing that I have a boundary, a horizon, where she's on the other side. And to be exposed to your own limitations in this way, whether I agree or does not agree with that thing. But she's amazing. And there's a whole generation So let me read one quote from her, and then we can move on. But this was this sort of the whole idea, because it's not about like nature anymore. There is no culture in nature. Donna Haraway says culture, nature, nature, culture. It's like there's not.
No, it's really exciting. And when I left Rien this summer after seeing the show, I literally, spent hours and hours following your recommendations, just listening to Natasha Myers, to lectures and talks. And I can really recommend it to you all. It changes so much the perspective on plants. A bit like Emanuele Coccia also, no?
Yes, exactly, yes. Such a long quote. Let me see if I have a shorter one. They are on the homepage. I'm sorry, I should have taken a shorter one. I have like hundreds of quotes here. So out of the so-called triple O's, the object-oriented ontologies, a movement came together with the identity politics, right? Together with the queer theory and feminist work, not at least out of the black communities. Black queer theory is, as I see it right now, the most interesting thing you can find in the whole world right now. It is so radical and so.
Well, that's why Alexis Pauline Gams is super relevant.
Yes, yeah. And Saidiya Hartman on the transatlantic, and like Escobar and Mignolo on the Latin America's north-south axis. And there's ideas in there that are so fertile and radical. So let me sort of step out of me just sort of rambling on about this thing. I have a tiny little bit of hope in younger people who are so easily identifying with this massive landscape of thinkers that are out there. And some of them are so radical that they are close to becoming like militant groups. And they were so radical in the environmental stuff. It was about indigenous rights in Mexico, right? So, what are we going to do? Who has the answers? Right? You know, the strongest resistant to nuclear power is the famous environmentalist who's been the editor of Environment for The Guardian for many years. Also, his name I can't remember. It's like the most unserious talk ever, this one here. He, last week before Glasgow, came out and said, the numbers are not adding up. I have to bet for nuclear. And he's for the whole, in the 70s, he was throwing rocks at the police on nuclear things. Bill McKibben, Bill McKibben with 360, the most important American environmentalist, he's also talking about diversification of energies. We are slowly having to take some very, very steep steps, and I'm not ready to. I just can't even imagine it. And that's why I think that, Donna Haraway, Natasha Myers, and now we use Anna Wiers Justice, these people who can see the invisible, where I'm blind. And I'm grateful for working with an amazing institution like this or here and there, because then we can somehow try to see more. And this is why I think the museums has something unique. And and this is a big discussion then, of course. So it's not anymore about institutional critique. It's not. I'm collaborating with the museum. I'm not against the museum. That's why liberation, I like it, liberation is like me. But this is about, that the time of championship is over. I'm not anymore a champion. I'm just one of all of us. I'm one of the trees, I'm one of the flies, I'm one of the cats, I'm one of you.
And to give us this, perspective, the tree would have in the exhibition, the birds would have in the exhibition, the bats would have in the exhibition. You use technology, and I wanted, towards the end of this talk, to kind of ask you a little bit about technology, because that's, of course, what was the quote also of Alexis Pauline Gams, who said, if we want to create this communion, this unlearning and relearning, we need to find ways to use technology differently. And you use, of course, technology in this show, using actually also all kinds of cameras, which give us different perspectives, of the show. But you use technology in many different ways. You work with augmented reality, you did several pieces also with Acute. But there is one project, so I wanted to kind of ask you, tell us a little bit about that, the way you use technology for these endeavors, and then particularly to tell us about a still unrealized project, because you basically started from these devices, right, are about to invent a different device. And this different device would be called a dumb phone. It's a collaboration with, it's not a smartphone, but it's a dumb phone. And it's a collaboration with the amazing Pireni Sundarlinga, who is a poet, is also a technologist, one can say, I mean, a great expert in technological questions, is basically a neuroscientist, so an incredibly interdisciplinary practitioner. And we had a talk with Pireni and you, where we actually talked about how also to use this dumb phone to, in a way, create more empathy. It would also be a kind of an ambiguous phone. You came up with a lot of ideas, a phone which every now and then would also switch off. Can you tell us about technology and a dumb phone instead of a smartphone?
Yeah, but also thanks to you. So at the DLD in Munich, we had this excellent idea of launching a phone which was just fake. It's just like, we call it a hacking event, culture hack, right? And not to disrespect the real culture hacker who's like really doing great work. So we said, okay, why don't we announce a phone and we just pretend we worked on a phone for a long time. So Pireni, that you mentioned, out of San Francisco, brain scientist, child computer game consultant, psychologist for government or public offices, and martial arts. It's like, do you see it again? So martial arts, right? It's very interesting. The body, brain, and numification of children, like the loss of socio-empathic evaluational skills. So Jonathan Safran Foer, the author, calls me and says, I think we should do a phone out of wood, like against the phones. I was like, wood? It was like not about wood, it's about the brain. And then we talked about that. Then the film came, Social Network, what's it called? The Social Dilemma. Yeah. And Pireni was one of the 6 people who did the Social Dilemma. Do you know the film about how, and everyone, of course, including you, are following the Des Raub, or the sort of colonization of our data extracted from us without paying us anything for it, right? And the famous book, Capitalism of
Surveillance Capitalism.
Surveillance Capitalism. Yes,
yeah.
and so on. So, and of course, we are just like sleeping pills. Of course, our generation, right? Because, like, roughly speaking, but the people who are younger than us, they're so. In Africa, the amount of extraction of data, this is the new mining, this is the new colonization. We're like enslaving them on the, anyway, so huge topic, huge, right? And we have all the phone companies, Samsung, Apple, everyone, that's just sleeping pill factories. It's like pacifying us. Anyway, new phone that represents our interest, right? It represents us. So if I have a phone, it is my phone and it works for me, right? It sounds like totally normal, but that's not how it is right now, because we first of all pay a fortune to be allowed to give our personal data away. I know this is, I'm generalizing a little bit. Anyway, we launched the phone, we sort of really pretending that this is a new phone. Oh, we worked on it a long time, and it's kind of silent, and we said dumb phone. It's not really dumb, but it's just fun to call it dumb. It's much smarter, because if there is a child in the room, it turns off automatically. You can sort of, if it doesn't have all that shit on it, it just has, it can ring, but it can do a lot of other things. It sort of harvests the data. It has a LiDAR scanner. These LiDAR scanners are amazing. Why don't we, of course we have that. So it's not that dumb. It's not some kind of hippie back to the cave being all sort of Icelandic again. No, it's a really smart phone, because it's about identity politics and ownership of data, and about decentralizing and all that stuff, right? And I'm not really, that's not really my field, but I say, that's great. I love to be on the stage in Munich together with you, just say, this is our new phone, and then see what happens. And nobody called me, but a lot of people called Pireni, because he sounds so much more interesting than me, and her credentials are also much better. And nobody called Jonathan, but Jonathan Safran Foer he just doesn't answer the phone. And we're still working on it. And of course,
so it will be more embodied, right? Yeah, it's a kind of an embodied
yes,
phone.
and I was talking to Apple because of something else. I was trying to extract in return. I was like kind of like this, and I said, "You're so stupid. This is the real shit. Right? This is, you say, oh, these are our enemies. We're so stupid. Of course, it's not your enemies. This is the next generation. Just like wake up, sleeping pill factory, right? This round thing is like you are tired, and then you're really sleeping when you come out." Norman Foster, right? So, anyway. So here we are, technology, VR, AR, and there's so much interesting stuff in terms of brain motoric body things going on in the VR. And this I could just talk about that for days, but I've come up with a term called the dolphin problem. If you have tried VR, you probably tried that without knowing, you somehow always end up on the top of Himalaya, on the moon, on the bottom of the ocean, or next to some bloody fucking dolphin. And then you're standing there on some blue laguna, and there's all this sort of exciting stuff, and you look, and then there's a dolphin right next to you. But the dolphin problem is the dolphin doesn't know you're there, right? You are basically totally exploited to think that the dolphin is actually there. So basically, it's just the same as sitting really close to the TV, which is just a sleeping pill factory problem, actually. So then we worked on motoric and neurocognitive activities, how to steer through. And this is then, so I follow it from a humanistic perspective. I'm sorry, so I don't want to go long, but it really always comes down to psychology and these things. And it turns out the best advice I got on the VR is from the amazing, amazing scientist, Joe Dumit. And he is a contact impro dancer. And I could not believe it. In the early 70s, out of the Yvonne Rainer group, there was these kind of experimental dancers. And some of them are still alive. Joe, for instance, right? And he came into my, now I have, he was in my studio yesterday teaching some painters how to paint. And he's always bare feet. Suddenly I said, oh, you know, I'm working on this VR thing. And then he says, from a perspective of contact impro, there is the dolphin problem. He says, concentrate on something else. Yes, I say, here is what I think about it. And he worked with a group of scientists who does focus on roots of trees, which with a LIDAR scanner, you can just scan the root through the earth, right? And he says, there's something very interesting. He's the guy who solved the nausea problem, right? We get seasick all the time, right? There is something called the roots out of 22 scientists in Amsterdam from the whole world, scientists, and they are in VR looking at the roots of a piece of forest. And what is really interesting, because now I looked at it, so all these roots, and it's amazing. And it's just like kind of like, oh shit, I'm gonna make a show. I was just like, how am I gonna make a show? This is like amazing. But what is really amazing, in the VR, one scientist is like interested in this, but one scientist is interested in this. And the scientist is interested in this, he of course does like this to enlarge it. But for the other scientist who looks at him, he gets smaller and smaller. Because otherwise it would be a mess, right? And then the other scientist, he does like, I need to look at it like this. But for me, the scientist just goes like this. And do you understand? In geometry and algebra and the central perspective since the Renaissance, we have had 4 dimensions. And pretty much the whole modern contract and how we stand on the ground has been in that idea of the 1, 2, 3 and time, right? Maybe 5 if you're a little funky, but all in all. And suddenly we now have the shrinking dimension, right? Because I'm talking to the scientist. And then it's like, should the sound be smaller also, or should not? And then you had one scientist standing this way, and he's just like working on something. He sees working on something. Of course, most of it is women, by the way. These are the only ones who are smart enough to actually be so radical. Okay, see now, so let me just stop here. But I'm just saying, with new technology, it's not about the new technology. The slow new technology is only slow because they're trying to take our money. And I don't mean like take our money or not take our money, but you know what I mean. It's like, it's very basic. But there's so much interesting stuff where the body and the perception of reality and the reorganization of systems and the reorganization of power and sort of, there's no freedom. That's never going to come anyway, right? But I'm just saying, this is such an interesting time. And there's like stuff for tons of exhibitions in museums who dare to be progressive enough. Like this old, this progressive, no, how should I say? I was just thinking about that.
But in a way, this is a wonderful conclusion because it kind of brings us back, you know, from a technology point of view, also back to this very embodied physical experience of the show, because you were also telling us that, you know, the viewer, the visitor of the show does 50 or at least 50% of the work. And of course, with these projects you do with technology, as you and Pireni explained at DLD, the mandate kind of comes back to the user. It's in a way, and then I was thinking, does it have to do with delinking? And when I asked you about that, you and Pireni said it's maybe, because Paul Chan always says, we need moments of delinking. So I was kind of thinking maybe the dumb phone would help us to delink. And then it was very beautiful, actually, Pireni and you answered both at DLD, that it's not about delinking, but it's about the depth of the connection. And that, I think, is what you've been telling us so in such a beautiful way today about the show. So Olafur, I'm so grateful to you all for being here, and a big round of applause for Olafur Eliasson.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot.